Welcome to another episode of Well-Adjusted Mama. I'm your host, Dr. Laura Brayton, and today's guest is Topiler Mooney, speaking on hormone balance for optimal fertility. Ina is a clinical nutritionist, co-founder of My Custom Cleanse, and owner of Complete Nutrition and Wellness. She holds a master's degree in human nutrition and is certified with the ACN, CBNS, and AADP. After graduating from Lehigh University with a business degree, Ina entered the corporate world in the field of finance. However, by the time she turned 25, she began to feel sick, developed digestive disorders, and was chronically tired. Not wanting to commit herself to a lifetime of drugs, Ina found a clinical nutritionist that was able to show her the proper way to eat and discovered many imbalances through various functional tests. Ina was able to take charge of her condition and drastically improve her health and well-being with health-promoting superfoods, high-quality supplements, and natural therapies. The effects had such a dramatic impact on her life that she changed her career so that she could help others experience the same kind of success in their lives. Ina completed a master's program in human nutrition at the University of Bridgeport and went on to complete a food-based program at the Institute of Integrative Nutrition. She got certified as a nutrition specialist by the American College of Nutrition and constantly maintains her degree with various courses to stay current with the newest research and continually expanding her knowledge. Patients now work with Ina to customize a personal program of diet, supplementation, and cleansing for their personal needs and goals. Ina works with all types of health concerns with a special focus on stubborn digestive issues. For more information, please visit her website at CompleteNutritionandWellness.com. Welcome, Ina, to the show. I'm so excited to have you on today.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm really excited to be here and talk about everything.
Yeah, so today's topic for Well-Adjusted Mama is focusing on hormone balance for optimal fertility. And I've personally known Ina for several years. She's a practicing nutritionist right here in Hoboken where I practice. And Ina, I'd love for you to just start off by telling our audience a little bit more about you and, why you chose to become a nutritionist.
Sure, of course, absolutely. So I think like many other practitioners that are in the more sort of wellness and holistic space, I actually became a nutritionist due to some of my own personal health challenges. I actually started out working in finance, and I did that for about 8 years after college, but I've had a lot of different health concerns at that time. I had a lot of yeast issues, a lot of digestive issues. I was getting headaches all the time. I was really tired for someone who was, in their mid-20s. And I also had really terrible skin. I mean, I had really bad acne that I just felt like, for someone who's, past puberty, why is this still happening to me? And of course, like most people, I went to the dermatologist and the gastroenterologist and my regular doctor and, they ran the test and they're like, well, everything seems okay, you're fine. And so I'm like, okay, well, I don't feel well, I don't think I'm fine. So I went to more doctors and it was the same kind of situation, you're fine, everything is okay, and after a while it turned into, well, maybe it's in your head, maybe you're depressed. And I was trying to explain to them, no, I'm not depressed. I mean, I might be feeling depressed because I don't feel good, but I'm not actually depressed. And I really, unfortunately, just wasn't offered much help aside from, take an antidepressant or, take something else with kind of a Band-Aid to cover it up. And I knew, that there's got to be something else out there. I was hoping, that there was. And, back then this was, 16, 17 years ago actually now. So, Whole Foods and other health food stores were not as popular and there wasn't as much information about it, but I ended up finding a who specialized in candida and digestive issues and, I saw him and he explained to me, actually all of this is due to, these different factors and we ran a lot of tests and he explained how my diet affected things, but also how my history, I was on a lot of antibiotics as a child and, there's certain other medications that I took and, he kind of just explained how everything was sort of a perfect storm situation, that created it. And it just made so much sense to me. It wasn't some foofy, there was so much science to it, and it kind of made sense from a biochemical standpoint too. So after, kind of working on my own health and seeing what changes I can make just through diet and supplements and lifestyle, and I started to feel better, I kind of thought, well, I want to do this and help other people. And it started out for me I wanted to go back to school just so I can learn more to help myself better And then it sort of became, me helping friends and then friends of friends and then the practice started that way. So it's been a long journey, but definitely a very exciting one for sure.
Yeah. I remember, watching you go through, some towards the beginning of you starting your practice, and it was really exciting to see that you were really able to, do what you actually love, something you're very passionate about, something that was, filling you up from a emotional standpoint that it didn't look like you were getting from your previous career.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing with it too is that, when you go through this on your own, you understand what it feels like. So when you meet people, I think that just being able to kind of understand where they're coming from, being able to empathize, I think it just sort of that instant connection, it's easier to form, because you know where they're coming from. And then, since then, the practice has gotten really busy. And, we, work with, all types of clients now with all types of issues, from chronic issues of digestion to, energy issues to weight loss and autoimmune, thyroid, a lot of fertility work as well. And then we also, my partner and I have an online, second sort of practice, which is, my custom cleanse for people that, don't have as many chronic issues, but just need some support and want to feel better and get on a better plan and get something customized rather than getting something that's just like in a box kind of plan. So with the practice being as busy as it is, that's sort of our way to help those that aren't able to get in for an appointment that still can get customized help. So it's been exciting.
Yeah, that's really exciting. And your practice is complete nutrition and wellness. And
yes.
People can find you online through that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about, since we're focusing on hormone balance, a lot of women, when they're thinking about getting pregnant and having, their fertility optimized, they're thinking immediately sex hormones. But I know that you feel also very passionate about educating women about all the other hormones that are involved with the fertility process that make up the neuroendocrine system. So do you mind just briefly giving us a little overview of what that is and how it impacts a woman's body?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of times when people come to practice and they'll say, well, I'm going through, I'm having some issues with fertility and I went to the doctor and I had my FSH tested and it's okay, and they think, okay, it just stops there. But there are, like you said, so many other hormones that are involved, from our adrenal hormones, which is our adrenaline, our cortisol, our ACTH, to our thyroid hormones. We're going to get into that in much more detail later on this call. And we have our pituitary hormone, the TSH, and thyroid hormone, T4 and T3. And the adrenal and the thyroid hormones are just essential to fertility, much more so than I think many people really realize. And then we have LH, and then we have other pituitary hormones. We have hormones of the pancreas, like insulin and glucagon, and then hormones of the kidneys. And it all plays a role because what's important, I think, for people to know is that our body works as this very complex organism, right? And it's a system of, thousands of different biochemical pathways. And if things are not functioning properly, it's going to affect everything else because everything is so intricately related. So, we can't just say, okay, let's just take our FSH, or even, a lot of people think of estrogen and progesterone, of course, as well. Those are very, very important, but we can't take those and forget about everything else because of how all of those work together.
Right. That's so true. So I'm really glad that you're and this is like actually a holistic approach, right? The holism of looking at the person as a whole and addressing thyroid or adrenal imbalances, because knowing that even if the hormone levels, the sex hormone levels are coming back normal, it is still going to impact fertility. And so I'm really excited that we're going to be discussing that. So before we get into that stuff, let's talk about the sex hormones and how, what happens during a normal menstrual cycle with the fluctuation in the sex hormones, and how a woman can kind of become more aware of these fluctuations and correct any imbalances that might be occurring.
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is definitely very important. And what I think people should know is that you can actually start looking at what your cycle is doing even before necessarily seeing a doctor. Maybe some people can't get into a doctor right away, or maybe there's issues with, insurance or payment. You can actually track your cycle, and we'll talk about some of these things now, and know, at least have a good idea, I should say, of what it's doing. So, if we take a typical, let's say, 28-day cycle, most people think that, if I have a 28-day cycle, then I'm going to ovulate on day 14 and we'll call it a day. But that's not always the case. We do ovulate on, different days. But basically, when we look at what your estrogen does, your estrogen usually starts out low when you, on the first day of your cycle, which is when you get, your period. And then estrogen will, go up and, usually spike right before ovulation happens, so that helps to stimulate it. And then it'll go down a little bit, and then it'll come back up, and it'll peak again around day 21 or 7 days after ovulation. And then it'll slowly come back down and then be lower, and that's when the person would get their period again. Now, with a 28-day cycle, it doesn't necessarily mean ovulation will be on day 14. There are some people who may ovulate earlier on day 10. In that case, let's say the estrogen spike is going to be a little bit before that. And that's still okay because they still have, a good amount of time in their cycle. And there are some people who ovulate later, sometimes day 15 or 16 or 17. And usually that's not a problem either unless the ovulation is too late, because then that doesn't leave as much time for the luteal phase, which is the second half of the cycle. But usually if it's, 28-day cycle and someone ovulates on day, 15 or 16 or 17, that's not normally an issue. And then for progesterone, and progesterone is very, very important for fertility, progesterone doesn't actually do all that much during the first part, which is the follicular phase of the cycle. So when you get your period, your progesterone normally drop, and it stays low, usually below 1, up until ovulation. So if ovulation is on day 14, then at that point, once ovulation happens, progesterone will start to slowly go up, and it looks kind of like a bell-shaped curve, where it'll go up slowly, and it'll peak around day 21 or around 7 days or so after that person's ovulation, and then it will slowly come back down, and usually when it drops is when the next period will come. And it's really important to know that because I find that there's a lot of confusion with testing. A lot of people, when they go see their doctors, they'll do a day 3 test. Well, they'll look at FSH and they'll look at LH, and sometimes they'll also do the estrogen and progesterone at that time. And while that can be helpful for certain things, it's not very helpful to actually find out if the person is ovulating. And it's very important to have ovulation because that is when the egg is released, which is what we need to be able to become pregnant. So if you test progesterone on day 3, as we were just saying, on day 3, not much really happens with progesterone. So it's going to look low, but it's supposed to be low then. So it doesn't really give us much. So I always recommend that while FSH and LH should be tested earlier in the cycle, estrogen and progesterone are much better tested towards the end and timing it about 7 days after ovulation. And it's not just counting to day 21, but it's, looking at the cycle to see when they are hopefully ovulating and then counting 7 days and testing then. And then we can see where the estrogen and progesterone is, but also what the ratio of the two is and if progesterone is high enough to be able to sustain a pregnancy. Now there's also some things that people can do on their own without the testing if they're not ready to do the testing yet. So one of the things that I love is doing temperature tracking. And the way that that's done is we would have to purchase a basal body temperature thermometer. Well, you can buy that at any pharmacy. And we would take our temperature first thing in the morning. Now, it is important to take it before you actually get out of bed. And it's also important to try to do it around the same time. I understand that sometimes people get up a little bit earlier or a little bit later. If it's within an hour or so, it's not usually an issue. If someone has a very erratic schedule where they wake up, say, at 5 in the morning one day and then at 10 a.m. another, that could be, a little bit too much difference. But if it's around a similar time, then that usually works very well. And what's interesting with temperatures, your temperature actually changes as your cycle changes. So, most women are going to average somewhere around the high 97s, even though we know that 98.6 is, what the temperature should be. I find a lot of women, especially people a little bit more on the petite side, they're going to be more like 97.8, 97.9, and that's fine. That's not too low. And then the temperature is going to fluctuate by maybe 0.1, 0.2, maybe 0.3 of a degree, because that just fluctuates from day to day during the first half of the cycle. However, if everything is functioning well and if all the hormones are in balance from the estrogen and the progesterone side of things, then the temperature is going to actually go up about a half a degree or more after ovulation has occurred. So people will see if they track their temperature that they may be at 0.6, 98.8, and somewhere between those two numbers on day 1 through day, say, 14. And then on day 15, they may jump from like a 97.8 to maybe like a 98.3 or a 98.4. And that's that half a degree jump saying to us that ovulation has already occurred. And at that point, we know that the egg has already been released. And that's a way, a very inexpensive way to basically check if the person is ovulating. If the temperature doesn't go up, usually there is some kind of an issuing. It's hard to say exactly. We'd have to do a little bit more testing, but it would be the first thing that they would sort of see that something could be going on that may not that would be affecting ovulation. Another thing that I like to look at is cervical mucus. And it's one of those things, some people notice it naturally, some people kind of have to pay a little bit more attention to it. And usually in the beginning of the cycle, most people don't notice too much, after their period is gone, maybe just some spotting. And then about, I would say, in between 3 and 5 days before they're about to ovulate, cervical mucus actually becomes sort of this clear substance. It almost looks like egg whites, raw egg whites. And it's kind of like gooey and it's very, very clear. And that, the body actually does that on purpose because that cervical mucus is what actually has a lot of different nutrients and even certain sugar that helps the sperm to stay alive longer. So our body's really amazing how, it does all of these things. And then once ovulation occurs, the cervical mucus usually changes from that egg white, clear mucus to a more whitish, creamy. Now it's not going to be, sometimes when people hear white, they think, oh, yeast infection or bacterial infection, but it's not like that. It's not clumpy. It's just more of a creamy, white rather than a clear mucus. And so if someone is seeing those cervical mucus changes and their temperature is also going up, that's a really, really good sign that, they are at least ovulating. Now, of course, not to say that there can be other problems down the line, but that's, something that at least they have, a cycle that's functioning the way that it's supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. That's really great information. And I know it's also the temperature that you were mentioning in the morning is also a good way to check for thyroid function. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. And the thyroid function, there's a lot there. It's actually a lot more complex than people realize. So I love that we're talking about it because I think it's really, really important. And I can't tell you how many patients we have in the practice who have underlying thyroid issues and have unfortunately had fertility issues. We've had people even with multiple failed IVF treatments, where once we kind of dug in further, the thyroid is really what was affecting it. But the good news is it's something we can look for, we can find it, and we can also fix it. So, that's the beauty of it. That your thyroid is actually extremely important for fertility. I think that when most people think about thyroid, they tend to think about thyroid as it's related to energy and weight loss or metabolism, because I think that's what's often advertised and that's what you see in books and on TV. But your thyroid hormone is actually needed for literally every cell in your body, from your head to your toe. So, you need thyroid hormone to actually bring up the best eggs. You need it to maintain proper hormonal balance for your estrogen and your progesterone. You need it for your digestive system. You need it for the health of, your brain, I mean, literally for everything. And there are so many people that have what we call subclinical hypothyroidism, where their levels may seem okay, but really there are some things going on. So temperature is definitely one way to get a little sneak peek at it, because usually if temperature is too low, and too low I think kind of depends on the person, it depends on how much they weigh, how much body fat they have, but I would say anything that's below about 97.5 is to me a little bit of a red flag, and it's an indication that something could be going on. So, if the listeners are checking their temperature and they're seeing numbers like 97 or 96.9 or something like that, then, it's definitely something where they should think, okay, let's look into thyroid a little bit more. Now, the way that we look at thyroid, and I wanted to just explain it a little bit further because I think if the listeners understand how the thyroid hormones work, and I promise I'll explain it in an easy to understand way, I think it would be then easier to see, how it relates to everything else. So, just kind of briefly going through it, your thyroid is actually controlled by your pituitary, which is then controlled by the hypothalamus. So, your pituitary actually produces a hormone called the TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone, and that's what most people get tested when they go to the doctor and test for thyroid. And TSH is certainly very important. I'm not trying to downplay it in any way. However, because it's just the stimulating hormone, it only tells us a very, very small part of the picture. It doesn't really show us everything. So then what happens afterwards is that once your pituitary stimulates the thyroid via this TSH, your thyroid then has to produce two hormones, T4 and T3. Now, just so we all are on the same page, T4 is actually not really active. It's called the prohormone, whereas T3 is the active hormone. And T3 is really what goes to all of our cells, and that's what helps us with metabolism and energy and menstrual cycle hormones, fertility, and all of those things. Now, what's interesting to know is that when the TSH stimulates the thyroid, your thyroid actually produces about 93% T4 and only 7%, of T3. And so people always ask me, well, wait a minute, you just told me that T3 is active. Why would your body only produce 7% of something that you need? And the reason for that is that our bodies are actually really smart. So there's always a reason for things. And because thyroid hormone is needed for all of the different cells in the body, if you were to produce the T3 active hormone right there in the thyroid in large amounts, it would be used by all the cells that surround the thyroid, so the cells in your neck and maybe around the head, and there actually wouldn't be enough to go to the rest of your body because it would be used up. So the body is very smart, and what it does is it produces the T4, and then T4 is going to convert to T3 inside the liver. And the way that works, and this is very important because a lot of people have issues with this conversion, is that T4 has to travel to the liver. And if anyone has had thyroid blood work before that's complete, they may notice that they check something called a total T4 and something also called a free T4. And what that means is total T4 is basically bound to proteins, and free T4 is free. It's not bound to anything. It's available to cells. So the way I like to explain it is that if you almost imagine that the T4, once it's produced in the thyroid, it's kind of like it jumps on a truck. And when it's on a truck, it's bound to that truck, and so it's in its total form. And then the truck is going to drive to the liver, and in the liver, it is going to convert to T3. Now, the conversion usually happens, if everything is working well, about 60% of T4 is going to be converted to T3, which I know 60 doesn't seem like a good amount, but that's the best that it could be. And then the other 20%, the T4 is going to convert to T3 in the GI tract. And so it's really important also to have a good functioning GI system where we have enough good bacteria and not too many bad bacteria or yeast or other overgrowth, because all of these things could affect the conversion. And then hopefully we have a total of 80% that converts. And then the other 20% is going to convert to something called reverse T3. And what I always tell people is think of reverse T3 as like an overflow. So just in case there's too much, we get some reverse, but we don't want to have too much reverse because too much reverse is going to then offset the regular T3, and then we'll have less T3. Now, once we have this conversion, and by the way, too, in order for the conversion to happen, since most of it is in the liver, we need to have good liver function. And our liver is sort of like our filter. So that's what processes all the different toxins that we're exposed to, from the environment, the water, the foods that we eat, certain medications that we may be taking. So that's why, we hear the word cleanse a lot. And I know sometimes cleanse can have negative connotations depending on what kind it is. But in general, it's really important to lead a clean lifestyle and try to eat things that, come from the earth that don't have as many toxins and chemicals and additives in them. And, the same thing with our water and trying to, have a good clean environment and use natural products on our skin and, in our home because that will avoid as many toxins. But I also think that it's important for pretty much everyone to do a little bit of liver support, at least once or twice a year. Nothing, really kind of crazy there, but just maybe some herbs or that help to cleanse the liver. There's certain foods, any kind of greens or bitter types of foods are really good for cleansing. So I think that's really important for all of us because the world we live in, unfortunately, it's just very different now than it used to be, 50 or 100 years ago. So then, with the conversion, if we have great liver function, great digestive function, and then there's also specific nutrients like selenium that are important for that enzyme that helps to convert the T4 to T3. So when we have all of those things, we hopefully then convert a lot of our T4 to T3. And then what will happen is the T3 is going to then jump on the truck. So it's going to be called now total T3 because it's bound to the truck. And the truck is going to drive around the body and look for cells that need it. And then when it finds a cell that needs it, basically the T3 is going to jump off the truck. So at this point, it's going to be in its free form, and it's going to knock on the door of the cell, which is the receptor, and it's going to basically ask, hey, cell, do you need me? And the cell will say, yes, I do, and the T3 will get in. And so what's important is this end result that T3 gets into the cell because that's really what's active. So I know it's kind of a complex process, but what I'm trying to get across here basically is that if someone does a test for thyroid and they just look at TSH, they're basically able to see how the thyroid is stimulated. But just because the thyroid is stimulated and produces T4 doesn't mean that all of these things happen properly down the road. What the body has is the body has a really complex system of feedback loops. So in a sort of normal situation, when the TSH stimulates the thyroid to produce a good amount of T4 and there's enough T4, the body will feed back to the pituitary saying, hey, we have enough T4, so don't change TSH and it'll be okay. But there's so many reasons why those feedback loops may not work. And one of the biggest reasons that I find is stress. And, when we're under stress, and by the way, too, I want to mention stress could be physical or emotional. It's not necessarily that we have to have a certain trauma or, something happened in our life. Sometimes even let's say we have a parasite and the body's trying to constantly fight it. That's a physical stress on the body. Or we have a hormone imbalance. That's a physical stress. So, it really is a combination of all of those factors. And so
and chemical stress too.
Oh, of course, absolutely. Absolutely, from the toxins, yes. Yeah, between all the heavy metals and, the fillings that people have in their mouth and, a lot of the other chemicals we're exposed to in our environment, absolutely. And so, when we're under stress, our cortisol normally will go up. And when we have high cortisol, we are generally going to have more inflammation. And when we have elevated inflammation and certain inflammatory cytokines in addition to cortisol, those things are going to directly affect how the feedback loop works, and it's not going to feedback correctly. So people may have very low T4, however, it won't feed back to the pituitary to say, hey, raise TSH so that the doctor can see the TSH is high and give you something for it, and the hormones will remain low. And then on the conversion process, as we were saying, you need selenium, you need good liver function, but stress can affect that as well. And stress also can affect how the T3 actually gets into the cell, because when cortisol is high, it can block the receptors from working properly. And so, with all that, I think that when we do a thyroid test, we really want to do a very nice comprehensive panel. And what that panel should include is not just TSH, but also the total T4 and the free T4, so that we know how the T4 is being produced and if there is enough, and a total T3 and a free T3, which is going to tell us how the conversion is happening, and then what T3 is actually available to the cells. And then in addition to that, I usually add a reverse T3, because there's many cases where we see a normal T3, which we say, okay, that's fine, but everything is about balance in the body. You can't take things in isolation. So if you have a normal T3 but a very, very high reverse T3, we know that the reverse is going to affect the usage of the regular. So in sort of theory, your T3 is going to be low in comparison, and then you won't have enough hormones. And then while we're testing, I also usually add the thyroglobulin and the thyroid peroxidase antibodies. And those are antibodies that are made against the thyroid if someone has an autoimmune called Hashimoto's. I know it sounds like a very scary thing, but it's something that certainly we can work with, and it's something where the immune system attacks the thyroid, and it's important to know, because if that's the case, we have to really watch thyroid function to make sure that it doesn't decline and that we support it, because if the immune system constantly attacks the thyroid, then eventually it can destroy some of the thyroid tissue and hormone production will go down. And usually conventionally, if someone has Hashimoto's, oftentimes they just offer thyroid medication if needed, and just let's watch and see. And while certainly that could be one option, I find that there's a lot of different reasons for developing autoimmune, such as adrenal issues, stress issues, toxins, infections, and even certain food sensitivities. So in the practice, we look at these things, and I find like gluten, for example, plays a really big role. So if someone does have Hashimoto's, even if their thyroid function is not affected yet, which is great, we can give them some things to do to help calm the immune system, and we try to get them off gluten so that we don't further impact the thyroid. So it's ways to help to prevent the thyroid from being destroyed by the Hashimoto's as quickly, rather than doing nothing and just waiting.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's such a great explanation, Ina, of how thyroid works. And, really, I'm so glad you also mentioned how the hormones literally go to like every cell in the body that needs it. So it's, this is impacting a lot of different processes. I think that the average, even the average doctor may not be aware of all of how much the thyroid's involved in normal healthy function.
Absolutely. And, as a nutritionist, unfortunately, I can't order blood work through insurance. So usually what I would recommend is, we do a lot of integrative tests, but then I would recommend that our patients see their doctors, and I give them a list of parameters to run. And I say, can you please ask your doctor to run, a TSH and T4 and T3, and I, write everything out. And, usually everyone's very open and fine, but I've had some cases where doctors would say, well, why are you running them? I don't understand. Why would you want to see T3? This person has a normal TSH, and it's, and I explain to them and, how it works. But I think, again, it's, in medical school, as much as this is taught, it was a long time ago for most people, and then it just, they don't really use it as much, and so they don't always kind of look into it, as much in depth, as I think that we should. And, I have a lot of, cases where, people have a completely normal TSH, but low hormones. And for example, I have one woman who was feeling really fatigued and, felt like she was gaining weight, but also, was having trouble getting pregnant, even though her hormones seemed okay. She had normal estrogen, normal progesterone, very good FSH. She actually went through 8 IVF, cycles. 8 of them. And unfortunately,
unsuccessful.
One failed. Yeah. Very, very, very sad situation. And then I met her after this, so I didn't know her. She was going through that. So, I explained to her that there's all of these other things that affect, and I said, because you have a lot of other symptoms that I think could be thyroid related, let's check. Let's just look at your thyroid and see. And so we did everything, and her TSH was very normal. It was like, by the way, TSH ranges at the lab. They're about 0.4 to about 4.5. And that's, I think, kind of a wide range. So what I do is I narrow the ranges a little bit because I want people to be more in the middle and the more optimal ranges. So I'd like to see it between, about 1.5 and 3. And she was right around 2.2. So totally normal, not a problem. But then, and she's never really had anything other than TSH run. When we checked all of her other hormones, her T4, where normally it needs to be between 6 and 12, and even that, by the way, is a large range. I mean, I'd like it around 8, ideally. But she was at 3.5. So, I mean, it was way below not only my optimal range, but the lab range of 6.
Right.
And her free T4 also was very low. It should be between 1 and 1.5 about. Ideally, she was at like 0.6. And then it would made sense also that her T3 was low because we know that T4 is what converts to T3. So when you don't have enough T4, where are you going to get the T3 from, right? So her T3, I mean, I like it at least at 100, and she was at like 61. And then her free T3, of course, is very low too. And, so, I talked to her and I explained, everything that we were just talking about. And, now she was very interested in doing things naturally. And obviously as a nutritionist, I love doing things through food and using supplements and lifestyle to try and fix things. And I think that in a lot of situations that can be the case. But when it comes with thyroid, it kind of depends on the individual. And so there are some thyroid support nutrients like selenium, for example, that helps to convert, and there's thyroid glandulars that can help to sort of boost the whole function. But in her case, what I explained to her was that, her feedback loop is not functioning at all. So her T4 is really low, but it's not signaling to her body that her body needs to make more hormones. And so, I said to her, we're going to start addressing your adrenals and working on your stress and refilling a lot of the deficiencies that she had. She had, deficiency in B12 and other B vitamins and certain minerals. And, and I was saying that, with, doing all of that, we should be able to help both her emotional and her physical stress. But fixing the feedback loop takes a long time. For some people it could take 3 months, sometimes 6 months, sometimes longer, especially if someone has lived for, 35, 36 years with all of these different issues. And my concern was that with her hormones for the thyroid being as low as they are, if we take that time to fix all these things naturally, she will be denying her body of proper thyroid hormone for 3, 4, maybe 6 more months. And because it's not just fertility, but it's important for so many other things, including the function of her intestines and her brain, I felt that she could benefit from having some support from a thyroid hormone, at least in the meantime, until we fix all of the other things. Plus, also, she wasn't feeling well. She was tired. She felt like some days she couldn't get out of bed. And so there's an endocrinologist that I work with, and I recommended that she see him. And, he agreed that, she needed something, and he gave her a little bit of Armor, which is a bioidentical T4 and T3 combination, and just a low dose. She started on 60 micrograms, and she did great. Her levels came up within, 4 weeks. She felt much more energetic. She actually also noticed that her hair was growing a lot more, so she was really excited about that. And then, she's been staying on it, and, she does want to eventually get off the medication, which I think is going to be possible as we continue fixing that. But for now, especially because she's also trying to conceive, and it's very important in pregnancy that you conceive, but also when you're pregnant, to have the proper thyroid hormone, she's going to stay on the medication for the time being.
Mm-hmm. And has she gotten pregnant yet?
Not yet, but it hasn't been that much time yet, so we're waiting.
So, that's exciting.
It's very exciting. Yeah. And I always tell people that if your thyroid is not working properly, I suggest waiting 3 months before trying again. The reason for that is that even though we're born with all of the eggs that we're going to have, the body actually chooses the eggs that it brings up at every cycle. So when the thyroid is working well and things are functioning correctly in the body, it's going to choose the better eggs. If things are not functioning correctly, the body has less intention, to choose the better eggs, and the eggs that aren't as good come up. And unfortunately, even at a very young age, some of our eggs just are not good. That's just the fact of it. It's not our fault. It's just how it is. And because it takes about 90 days for that maturation cycle of the egg, it really, really helps to get the thyroid working well and give it that 3 months so that then we get the best eggs. Because what happens is if the egg is not good, it still can get fertilized, but it may have an extra chromosome or it may be missing a chromosome. And, that's usually not sustainable for life and will unfortunately end in a miscarriage. So I'd rather we wait a little bit of time, get the body working better, and then we'll have a better chance of a good egg coming up.
That makes so much sense. And it also, in addition to helping with hormone balance, it's an opportunity for some cleansing, detox to happen, which I think is really, ideal preconception as well. So it's just kind of cleaning out the vessel in preparation for the baby.
Yeah, exactly. I would love it if, when people are thinking about trying, if they know they want to try, say, in about 6 months, to come see us or come see you or come see, any of these wonderful practitioners that we have that help with preconception, so that they can really get their body ready. If we have that 4 to 6 months, oh goodness, there's so much we can do. We can really get the body working great. And
I agree. This is really, functional medicine, and it makes sense. It's like, let's, detect any hormonal imbalances that are maybe kind of subclinical. Like you were mentioning, they're a little bit more under the radar, but they can certainly impact fertility. Let's work on cleansing and detoxing our bodies and also our lifestyle. There's lifestyle modifications that need to happen. And, human nature, we can't necessarily make changes immediately and huge things overnight, right? Like we need some time to adapt to new lifestyles. We're used to one thing for so many years. So I think just being gentle on yourself and recognizing it's okay to give yourself that time. And, sometimes when women are over 35, they feel like this extreme urgency to need to get pregnant tomorrow. But it's better to wait that 6 months and get your body in a really good, healthy place prior to trying to get pregnant.
I completely agree. And I think it's all about your metabolic age, not necessarily the chronological age. I feel now I am in much better health in my 30s than I was in my early 20s. So, I wouldn't want to be pregnant then,
right.
now. So, yeah, definitely.
I agree. I'm healthier now than I was when I was in my early 20s. So, it is possible. And, it's the power of epigenetics where we get to, really choose what we put in our body, how we move our body, what we think, and that will really control what genes we're turning on and off and how our body will function in accordance to that. So I think it's really empowering and exciting that we have the ability. And if you don't know what to do to receive that optimal health, that's where, Ina was recommending just work with a healthcare provider that is doing functional medicine and can help, direct you, because it can be overwhelming, I think, to do it on your own. So it's nice to have that direction and also some accountability as well about how to stay on track.
Absolutely. And there's so many wonderful people around, in our area, but really all over the country.
All over. Exactly.
And a lot of people also do phone consultations. So even if you don't live near a practitioner who you're interested in seeing, you can do the testing at local labs and talk with them on the phone or over Skype, so, there's just a lot of wonderful people around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And I just wanted to wrap up this call if we could just maybe spend a couple minutes about adrenal function, because so that's also impacts fertility. And if you could just cover that topic, please.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So the adrenal glands are the glands that deal with stress, and they're very, very important. I think what's important to know there is that stress is something that is cumulative. And, if you're stressed here and there, it may not impact. But if you are stressed over and over and over again, it is going to impact the adrenal glands. So the glands are actually meant to be almost like an acute response system. So if we think back to like caveman times, let's just think of, a caveman being chased by a tiger. So what would happen is they're being chased by this animal. They are going to go into what's called fight or flight. So they're going to either basically try and fight the animal or run away. And the body has a lot of chemical changes that it starts to help the caveman escape. So basically the blood is going to go to the caveman's hands and feet so that they can, fight and run away. And all of the other processes are going to be put on hold. Because when you're being chased by a tiger, let's be realistic here. Is it important to try to fight a virus? No, not really. Is it important to digest our food or to get pregnant? No. We just need to run away and get safe. And so that's why the high adrenaline that happens from that is going to basically help to bring the caveman to safety. And then, hopefully they would outrun that animal and then the stress would go down and they would rest and everything would be fine until a few months later when maybe they're being chased again. But the adrenals, what they do is they kick in when they need to and then they rest and regenerate it when things are okay and then they're ready to kick in again. Unfortunately, though, in today's day and age, what happens is, yes, we don't have tigers chasing us, which is a very good thing, but we have a lot of different stressors, like we were saying, emotional stressors, physical stressors, chemical stressors. And so every day, most of us are exposed to some of it. And even though these stressors may not seem as big as being chased by a tiger, they are constant. And that's really where the problem is. So, the adrenal glands are constantly kicking in, but they never actually get the rest that they need because they're constantly working. And what happens physiologically in the body is that our cortisol level, which is the stress hormone, what it's supposed to do is when we wake up in the morning, it should be at its highest, within a certain range, of course, but at a higher point. And then as the day goes on, it should slowly drop throughout the day and be nice and low at night, which will help us to rest, relax, and get a good night's sleep. So it kind of looks like a ski slope curve, if you will. And oftentimes when we start feeling more of that constant stress, we might be okay with cortisol levels in the morning, but then it will go down and at night it will start to spike up when we feel stressed. And oftentimes people say that they'll get a second wind, or they feel like they can't get a very restful sleep, or I hear also from a lot of people that they wake up every day at 2:30 a.m. on the dot, they're startled awake, and that's a sign that the cortisol is not cycling properly and it's spiking at night. And the problem with that is that we were just saying when cortisol is too high, a lot of the other processes of digesting food, balancing hormones, processing a lot of the different chemicals in the body, that gets put to the side so the body can deal with whatever the emergency is, even though really there's no major emergency at that time. It's just our brain going and a lot of the different things that we're thinking about and going through. And then eventually what can happen is when the cortisol keeps staying high at night, there's not going to be enough of it for the morning time, so then the morning will drop and people will have what we call a reverse cortisol curve, where the cortisol will start out low in the morning and then it'll kind of slowly go up and spike at night. And then they feel like they can't get out of bed, they're super tired, and then at night they have the second wind and it's time to sleep and they can't. And so that's going to really impact our hormones and really, really greatly affect fertility. So what we want to do there is we want to support the adrenals from a few different directions. It's not just about, medication or supplements. It's really a combination of doing the biochemical things, but also the lifestyle changes. And you have to do both. You really have to do both. Yeah. And I always tell people, think of the adrenals as kind of like a delicate plant. So, if the plant starts to wilt and, maybe the leaves are kind of turning brown a little bit, you're not going to take a marker and paint it green, right? But what are you going to do? You're going to maybe put the plant by the window, give it some sun, some water, maybe change the soil. And so, there are specific nutrients that are really helpful. For example, B vitamins, vitamin C are sort of like the fuel for the adrenals. And then there's some wonderful herbs like rhodiola and ashwagandha and holy basil, and those herbs are called adaptogenic herbs. So what they do is they help to adapt. So if the adrenals are overacting a little bit, it helps to bring them down, and if they're a little bit under, and that could be from day to day, it helps to bring them up. And then in some cases, if the adrenals are really weak, there's some supplements called glandular supplements. And those are going to help naturally boost the adrenals and give them more fuel and regenerate them. But that, again, is just about half of it. The other part is we want to see what can we do about that stress. So from the physical perspective, we want to see, okay, let's make sure we don't have any hidden infections or things in our digestive system. Let's try to take out the chemicals that we're exposed to. Obviously we can't live in a bubble, but, let's see how maybe we could change our body care products out to ones that are more natural, and our household cleaning products, and try to drink water that's purified and clean versus tap water, and eat foods that, if possible, organic, or at least foods that, are made with more natural ingredients, so that, if we have something that does have to come in a box, that we understand and can pronounce all the ingredients. That's very, very helpful. So that will help to take some of the stressors off. And then more from the emotional end, I really, really believe in mindfulness. And, I think mindfulness can mean different things for different people. People always say to me, well, I can't meditate. I can't quiet my mind. You want me to sit in front of a wall and stare at it for 20 minutes? That's crazy, And I say to them, well, no. If you don't normally meditate, we're certainly not going to start by having you sit in front of a wall for 20 minutes, But, we can do things like, for example, some deep breathing. And that's just a very simple and very inexpensive way because, air is free. Because when we breathe very shallowly, usually when we're under stress, that signals the nerve endings at the top of our lungs, and that actually signals to the body that there's an emergency of some kind. Versus if we breathe deeply through our belly, that stimulates the nerve endings at the bottom of our lungs, which actually tells the body that we're okay, we're safe, we're protected. So just even taking a few deep breaths and kind of getting into a routine of doing that in the morning, also before meals, which will help you to digest your food better. And then at night, that could be a start. And then if someone is interested in kind of going a little bit further with it, there are ways to, for example, guided meditation, and we don't have to do 20 minutes. We can start with a 3, 4, or 5 minute one, and there's some wonderful things on YouTube and online where people can follow, something that's guided, where they're not doing it on their own, but they're following someone's, more kind of relaxing voice saying, okay, close your eyes, now think of this, imagine this, and that could be very helpful. But meditation.
That's what I do.
Have to be, Great. Yeah, it doesn't also have to be sitting still. You can do active meditation. So, for example, you go to wash your hands. If you really focus on everything that you feel as you're rubbing your hands together, as the soap is lathering, and then as the water is washing it off, just really being very present to that action, we've just shut down our mind for the 30 seconds we washed our hands and focused on that. That's kind of meditation in itself. Or taking a walk and just paying attention to the pretty trees and the flowers and just noticing those things. That can be considered meditation. So any kind of mindfulness, I think, is great, because if we could shut down our mind even for 30 seconds at a time, it's helpful. So I don't want people to think that they have to necessarily spend a lot of time or invest a lot of money and take a class. I mean, those things are great, of course, but you can start at any point, anywhere.
Yeah, it's really just being present to your environment, and, maybe it's even spending time with loved ones and being fully, giving full attention to, a spouse or a child. And not being distracted with a cell phone or other, things going on in your environment, and just focusing on that person. And just, I think that's so important for connection to yourself, connection to others, is being present, being mindful. Yeah, thank you so much for,
and especially
for
I think,
mentioning that.
Yeah, for women too. I always ask people, what do you do for fun? And sometimes when I ask that, people look at me like I have 3 heads, and they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, what do you enjoy? And they're like, well, I don't know. I take care of my kids, and I work, and I do this. I'm like, okay, I understand that, but what do you like to do? And people can't even think of that because they're so, busy with everything else. And I think just, really thinking about what they enjoy and giving that little bit of time, even if it's 15 minutes, for themselves is really important.
Yeah, so important, especially for mamas. So, Ina, thank you so much for coming on our show today and sharing your passion and wisdom for hormones and fertility. And I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and share the information.